Ladies and gentlemen, it's Ebro in the morning. Laura Stiles Rosenberg's on assignment with ESPN today. Nerd alert, nerd alert. We're about to go in on something that I've been working on for a little while and I thought was very interesting. The lady sitting in front of you, her name, I know her as Dr. Chanda. That's what I know. What is your last name? How do you pronounce it?
Prescott Weinstein.
Prescott Weinstein, which is, you're from Brooklyn, yes? Or your parents are from Brooklyn?
My mom is from Brooklyn by Barbados.
By Barbados. And your father?
My father grew up in Los Angeles. His parents are both Brooklyn born.
And so I noticed you on Twitter, you through an article, you had to remind me, you were profiled by Huffington Post.
Yes.
You are a black, which is very rare, black female astrophysicist.
Yes.
And so the article was about racism, I believe, and being a woman and being black and being an astrophysicist and some of the hurdles that you had to deal with in your path.
Yeah, so the backstory is they contacted me and said, we're doing a series of interviews with inspiring people. And I was like, okay, why are you talking to me? And so he called me up and asked me some questions about my background and my history. And I talk a lot. So I gave him a lot of material, and I thought he'll just pick 2 sentences from every question. And then it ended up being this extremely long interview where I talk about being raised by a single mom and the challenges that I faced as an undergraduate at Harvard and being one of the only ones and how much that sucks, and my work as a theoretical physicist and being Jewish, actually.
And black. And
black.
Single.
Yeah.
So theoretical physicist and astrophysicist, what's the difference?
Oh, that's kind of, it's almost a semantic preference.
Got it.
But I go back and forth. So I have 2 degrees in astronomy and astrophysics, and I have 2 degrees in physics. And I work at the intersection.
Nerd alert. Whoa. I love this. This is great.
Yeah, so it's technical.
Okay, so I don't even know where to start. What is astrophysics? What is astrophysics?
I think the best way to characterize it is that we study anything that is not on planet Earth, falls into the category of astronomy and astrophysics. So sometimes you'll hear people say astronomy, some people will say astrophysics. So astronomer is more likely to refer to people who actually use telescopes to look up at the sky and maybe just do what we would call observational work. So capturing images of the solar system or outside of the solar system. Astrophysicists are more likely to be doing interpretation work, so figuring out what those images mean. But it's kind of porous. People use astronomer or astrophysicist basically interchangeably. And then, so that's really what astrophysics is anything that's not on planet Earth falls in that category. Although, you get someone with a PhD and they're going to have a lot of opinions. So you ask like 15 people with PhDs like mine, and they will give you 15 different answers.
Got it. So on a day-to-day basis, and having you here, not only I think, we hope to inspire some youth, because I think a lot of people who listen to Hot 97 and see us, they're interested in becoming rappers, making music, athletes, obviously.
Yeah, we've had entrepreneurs here. We've had everyone.
We've had a lot of people,
Authors.
but scientists. Though.
Yeah, you might be our first one. You are.
I'm breaking barriers.
Yeah,
Yes,
you are.
exactly.
Yeah. And a woman and a black woman. This is amazing.
So what do you do every day? What happens? What's your job?
So I don't know if this is going to turn people off, but I do a lot of calculus every day.
But talk to us.
Yeah, walk us through like a typical day.
Oh, so a typical day, I wake up in the morning, and I should say my husband does a lot for me. So I wake up in the morning and I demand my morning tea. So he makes my tea for me. He makes my breakfast. I check Facebook, I check Twitter. So I'm really not that different from everybody else who wakes up and scrolls through their phone trying to find out what the latest news is. So one thing I'll do is I check something called the archive, which is where people publish new papers. Before they put them in a scientific journal, they make them publicly available so people can read them early on. And there's weird politics around when you should put it on the archive or not. And so I scan through that to see if anybody has written an interesting paper that I should look at. And so a couple of things I'm looking for. Did I get scooped? Did somebody already publish the thing that I was working on?
Okay.
Yeah, that's a big source of stress, especially for those of us who don't have faculty positions yet. And then for the people who do have faculty positions, for the ones who don't have tenure, this is basically your worst nightmare, is that you're working on something and then somebody comes up with the answer
Right,
using the same
right.
technique before you do.
Right.
Yeah.
And so on a day-to-day basis, and are you at a school now? Are you working at a university now?
Yeah, so I just left MIT and I'm at the University of Washington, Seattle now.
So you teach.
No, so actually I'm a postdoctoral fellow. So this is like, if you know anything about medicine, it's like the equivalent of being a resident. So you have your doctoral degree already, but you're not faculty yet. So there are a lot of pluses about this. I don't have teaching responsibilities, which means I don't have to be on campus all the time. And so I can do things like come to New York and go to a conference, which is
Right.
what I'm doing this week.
Wow. okay.
Super
Yeah.
nerd conference. She texted and was like, I'm coming to New York for this super nerd thing. You want to come? I was like, I'll be too scared to be in that room. What's the nerd conference you're doing?
So it's the International General Relativity and Gravitation meeting. I hope I got that in the right order. I'm scared to be there though.
You
Why?
are.
Oh yeah, I mean, so actually the first thing that happened to me, I got there early because I like to kind of get myself settled on Monday morning, and I'm sitting there and I'm working on a paper on particle physics right now. So I was sitting there typing on the paper, and this man who was sitting behind me gets up and starts talking to someone, and just keeps bumping his butt into my head, like I wasn't there. And it was really just like this is what it's like for me to go to conferences. It can be very like I just feel like an invisible ghost.
And why is that? Is that because you're small?
Yeah, so I think, it's a combination of things. I'm tall, but I'm narrow, right? So it could have been that. I think, if I was someone he had recognized, like a big name that he knew, probably he wouldn't have been so careless about my personal space.
Right.
So it's a lot of, and usually, and at this particular conference, I would say the ratio of men to women is even worse than at conferences that I usually attend.
Oh, then you need to be there. You
Yeah.
absolutely need to be there. You mentioned
But
earlier.
I'm not there because I'm here right now.
Well, you're going afterwards?
Yeah.
Okay. We need you over
Look at
there.
Laura cracking the whip. Get over there, represent women.
We need you over there. No, you mentioned earlier in the article they highlighted some pieces of your story. And can you talk about sexism and maybe racism in the world of science?
Oh, yeah. I mean, this week is such an interesting time to be asked that question because I think I actually wrote a piece last night that I haven't decided whether I'm sharing it publicly or not about what it's like to be Black this week and be a scientist and trying to focus on getting science done. And also, one of the things that I was doing Monday morning between writing the paper was actually scrolling through Twitter and Facebook to see who did the police shoot last night, who did the police shoot this morning.
Right.
And then being at this conference where there are all these other people who are not distracted in that way. And it's not even acknowledged. Like you're going through this thing, you're feeling a lot of grief, you're feeling a lot of trauma.
Of course.
I know people have family in every single city where someone has been killed in the last week. And so it's not just like a theoretical thing, but checking the news, like, do I recognize that name? Does a friend of mine or a family member recognize that name? So I think one of the tough things is that I and some of the white scientists I know asked our professional societies, put out a statement, say Black Lives Matter. It's important to let Black students know that their professional society is thinking of them, and also to let Black students know that they're entitled to be recognized in these moments. So it's not just that, it's about training them of what they are owed and entitled to. And it was a big fight, and people in various professional societies were like, so one person gave me the feedback. They said, well, we don't know that Black scientists want that. And so people kind of saying, oh, we don't know if you really care about Black Lives Matter that much, as if for us, it's not literally our lives, our families' lives on the line. So that's one of the things that's been happening this week. I think another thing that came up with Black Lives Matter was people using the term people of color instead of black.
Black, right.
Even though, and it is true, like last week, there was a Latino guy in Bell, not so far from where I grew up in California, who was shot by the police.
Yeah.
And so it's not just happening to black
That was
people.
the incident. It was like right after the 4th of July,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think I just read something about a young man also in San Diego who was just it was just a routine stop and he was gunned down.
It's hard to figure out how to talk to people who are afraid to say the word black. I would say that's one way to really kind of, if you had to pick a short way to think about the racism in science, people are afraid to use the word black. Like it's a dirty word. I feel like I need to blast.
I think
Yeah.
there is fear because people don't know what is socially acceptable and
Yeah.
they're trying to be politically correct.
Yeah.
I think political correctness can go too far and sometimes end up disrespecting people who want the respect of their culture or their
Right.
experience to be identified and spoken on and are proud of their experience, whether it's good, bad, or whatever we're going through, right? Because it's a defining moment. But being a woman, which is obviously an oppressed group, being a black woman, and traveling down your path, which there's only how many black astrophysicists are there?
Oh, astrophysicists. I actually don't know that number, but it's probably fewer than 20
Fewer than 20 just black.
astrophysicists.
Astrophysicists,
So
period.
if you talk about physicists, the number's probably in the 60s. And then if you broaden it to physicists and related fields like astrophysics and applied physics, then I think we recently hit 80. I think a student that I've mentored since she was an undergraduate, I think just became number 80. And I was number 63 on that list, on the broader list.
What about black women?
This is just black women. Black men are actually getting their PhDs at much higher rates in physics than black women are. And so there have been more than 100 black men, but black women in physics are such a small number. We haven't even hit 100 yet with PhDs. And just to give you a reference number, there are about 2,000 PhDs in physics granted in the United States every year. So to have under 100 in all of US history, that really gives you a sense.
Wow.
Yes, it's very small.
Yeah.
And what took you down that path?
So I was always a little bit nerdy about math. Not a little bit. I was a lot nerdy about math. I did times tables for fun when I was little. Not everybody goes down this path. So I should just say, you don't have to be the weird kid who sits and does times tables while everyone else
But you
is
love
like playing
numbers.
dodgeball.
Numbers was your thing.
I love numbers. And at some point I got exposed to science, I think in 5th grade, and my teacher told my mom that I seemed really into it. And so my mom took me to see this documentary about Stephen Hawking called A Brief History of Time. And I went in, and I was 10, so I thought independent movies are so silly. And my mom actually had to drive us from East LA to West LA. She was a single mom, low income, so that was actually a lot of money for her just to spend on the gas. And she took me and I complained, and halfway through the movie, they were talking about black holes and how we don't understand what happens at the center of a black hole. And I was like, whoa. So there's something that Einstein didn't understand, and you can get paid to worry about that. I was like, I can get paid to just like do math and worry about things Einstein didn't understand. That seemed like, I don't know, kind of a genius job move.
Right.
Yeah.
And that was it.
That was it. I sent an email to Stephen Hawking when I was 11. I looked up his email address, sent an email. One of his graduate students responded and said, this is how you become a theoretical physicist. And at that point, I said, okay, I'm going to go to Caltech or Harvard for college. And I got into both. I chose Harvard. And
So awesome.
I've just been like kind of on a single.
Well,
Yeah.
have you spent time, because I'm going to go down a path of numbers and math, and then we're going to get into the Bible and supreme mathematics and astronomy, et cetera, et cetera. What was it about numbers that have you been able to identify that?
So I think about this a lot, actually. I like the pattern.
Okay.
But I also found it was almost a linguistic thing. So I found it fascinating. I used to love writing out the 2 times tables. And I found it fascinating that every time I wrote the cross sign or the X sign, that it was basically the same as writing the plus sign. To me, that was just a really interesting visual pattern almost. And I should say, I need to write down math, I still can't really do arithmetic in my head. I have a PhD in theoretical physics, and I still can't do arithmetic. So I think for me, it was actually a visual pattern thing. And then I think later it was, whoa, why can we describe the universe and make these incredible predictions using these symbols on paper? That's such a bizarre and amazing connection.
And so, have you taken the time to take that, I guess, desire to see numbers and understand what they mean in a language form and applied that, the same way people apply astrology to their life of this day means this or my day is going to be like that? Have you made that jump, and is that jump logical?
So I definitely look for patterns in numbers. I'm a compulsive pattern finder. So I remember phone numbers by looking for patterns in phone numbers. I actually hate my current phone number because it
don't
doesn't
like the
really
pattern.
have good patterns. I've been stuck with it for 6 years. It's been hurting me a little bit. But yeah, I look for patterns like that. I tend not to assign too much meaning to it, but I think that a lot of people who end up in the line of work that I'm doing right now, there's just a fundamental pleasure that comes from recognizing the pattern. In the same way, I run a literary magazine, and we did this poetry thing on Monday night to raise money, and listening to the connections that people made between words and the way that they rhymed, or just the way that they flowed together and the rhythm that they had. There was a certain pleasure in that, along with the meaning that came out, where people were talking about being undocumented and Black Lives Matter and all of these things. I think it's a very human thing, but it's very base. It goes right to the root of who we are as animals, almost.
Have you ever studied supreme mathematics?
No, you're gonna have to tell me about this.
Well, somebody go get Shawnee Culture.
Please.
He knows the math better than me. Send Shawnee in here. So supreme mathematics has everything to do with the date and the number of the day.
Okay.
1 has a meaning, 2 has a meaning, 3 has a meaning, 4 has a meaning, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
So it's like numerology.
It
Yeah,
is
kinda like
numerology,
Okay,
right?
okay.
So they assign a meaning to each number.
Yeah.
And that number means that day has a certain math associated with the day and a meaning associated with the day. It's very, there's a spiritual enlightened movement called the 5% Nation, 5%ers, which was the best way to describe it was kind of an offshoot of the Nation of Islam in some regard, but also applying mathematics to the Bible and the amount of numbers that are mentioned in the Bible, and then taking those numbers and applying meaning, the same math, supreme mathematics, to those numbers, and understanding the communication that the Bible was trying to make as it related to the total universe.
Right.
And understanding those stories in the Bible as they related to the total universe. Because there are people who don't take the Bible literally, they take it figuratively, and the figures they're using are numbers to explain the natural elements that are going on around you every day. Is that a jump that you made in your studies or not yet?
So I would say, I have a weird relationship to spirituality. Like, I go to temple, I'm a member, I'm very actively involved. I talk to my rabbi quite a bit, mostly about politics and my frustrations with science. But there is an area of research called science, technology, and society studies, where they think a lot about the connections between how a society formulates its spirituality and therefore the kinds of questions that they ask. That's one of the research avenues. And this is something I've actually become really interested in recently, because it relates to the participation of minorities in science. We recently had a lot of issues in the astronomy community with racism against Native Hawaiians, because some astronomers want to build a telescope in a space that some Native Hawaiians consider to be a sacred space. And there was kind of a back and forth about whether Hawaiian spiritual values were as important as these astronomers' scientific values. And so I've been thinking a lot, what kinds of questions would I be asking about science and the way the world works if I had grown up in a different spiritual context, if I hadn't had a Western education that's descended from the Enlightenment? And it's certainly the case. There's a great philosopher of science, Sandra Harding, who has written some really interesting stuff about why certain discoveries were made in China and not in Europe, and why certain discoveries were made in Europe and not in China.
And she makes it spirituality related
Well, so it
or
becomes
culturally
it
related.
becomes about worldview and spirituality, which, until fairly recently were very, very entangled, particularly in Europe. But she and others have pointed out that, for example, in Western religion, we usually think of there's a God, and then there are strata below the God. And it's certainly the case that our scientific vision fits that we look for a grand unified theory from which everything flows. And even Stephen Hawking has said on occasion he was looking for the mind of God. This is very much how we formulate. Why do we ask these questions about the universe? So I tend to think about it more as we're just curious animals, and it gives us pleasure to think about these sorts of things. But I think it's certainly the case that, for example, there's another point of view where you're supposed to think about nature as being complete and whole, and you're not supposed to disrupt nature. And that will maybe lead you to ask different questions than a version of the universe where there's one thing on high looking down and there's a hierarchy. So when you believe in a hierarchical spiritual vision, maybe you ask different questions than when there's a more holistic spiritual vision.
And a more natural spiritual vision.
Yeah.
Flat Earth conspiracy theorists. I saw you on Twitter chime in on this. Artist B.O.B. Put out a picture. I think he was we don't know, but I ignored it for 4 or 5 days. I refused to. I was like, I'm not. We're not doing this. But then after the conversation reached the 4th day, I was like, is this a real thing where people believe Earth is flat? So I went online and I looked for flat earthers and discovered that there is a collective group of individuals, not so big, that have a theory that Earth is flat. And the reason we've been taught that it's flat, I'm paraphrasing, I think I understand their point, is that at the ends of the earth, there's some natural resources and some things that the government doesn't want us to know about.
That sounds like wishful thinking.
So they've convinced us that the earth is round so that we never go beyond, something like that.
Okay. I think I read, I think that's basically
Am I getting it right?
Yeah,
So is B.O.B. like a member of this group now?
I don't know. I don't know about all that. What's the guy, Tyson?
Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Neil deGrasse Tyson, who I love his narration and how his new cosmos, I love it. Speak about Earth. How do you know it's round?
How do we know? Well, it's easy now because we can send people up into space
And
you can just take a picture. And they're orbiting the planet several times a day. So, either the thing with conspiracies, though, is that someone could come at me and be like, yeah, but they're part of the conspiracy.
And it's CGI. It's not real. It's computer-generated graphic.
Yeah. Just like the moon landing was faked and all of this other stuff, which is a little bit sad, actually, because a lot of Black women worked on making the early space travel possible.
Wow.
This is something, there's a movie coming out starring Janelle Monáe and Taraji Henson that's going to tell some of the story about these Black women calculators who worked at NASA. So
that's dope.
People don't even realize that when they get into these conspiracy theories about NASA and about space travel and about science and stuff that people often think, oh, that's a white people thing, that they're actually talking about work that Black people did. And it's just that we're not educated about the fact that it's work that Black people did.
Wow.
So there are other ways that we know, even, the next time you get on a plane that has the ability to show you what your trajectory is.
Yeah.
You will actually see.
So the line is curved
The
slightly.
lines are
always curved, yeah.
Because if you go straight, you actually won't get to your destination. You'll end up in the wrong place. And there are cool things about that. So if you're flying from Washington, D.C. to Beijing or Shanghai, you might actually go over the North Pole instead of going around, because that might be the shortest route. So there are a lot of different ways. But I think anyone who's really a conspiracy theorist, it's going to be hard to talk them out of it, which I think, like you, I ignored the controversy at first because I was like, okay, I like his music all right. He's done a couple of good songs, but I don't need to be all that invested in like...
Wait, did you see her chime in? Did she clap back?
At a certain point, she was like, this is just ridiculous, I think she said.
So I think I had mixed feelings about it because I kind of had this feeling like, okay, so every time a Black person does something that's like a little bit questionable, everybody's like, oh, Black people, they do questionable things. And it's like, no, it was one dude. Like, why did it become a they?
Yeah.
And so then
And he's not the person who started the Flat Earthers movement.
no,
which is,
and he's not an expert. So like whatever.
Right.
That's a lot of my feeling about it is people have a lot of strange opinions and most of them don't have a big microphone. And so that definitely changes things because he's not just Joe Schmo on the street.
Right.
He's B.O.B. But I had and so then Neil Tyson gets involved. And I had this kind of weird feeling that I was seeing like a lot of white scientists posting like, oh yeah, Neil Tyson totally put that guy in his place. And it had this feeling to me that they were like, yes, the Black scientist put the crazy Black person in his place. And almost like people felt like we as Black scientists had a responsibility to come collect him. And I didn't really...
get your man, yo.
Yeah,
Yo, what's up with your man's talking about Flat Earth? Check him, yo.
I didn't really see why was it Neil Tyson's responsibility to respond. And I just didn't think it merited a response besides that guy's wrong. I mean, I do think Neil's a performer. I've spent time with him. He's a performer.
Yeah.
So
And he likes the attention, and I think he finds joy, and not likes the attention in a bad way, but likes the attention that Black people do science.
Yes.
And to encourage more young people, which is another reason I asked you to come here, is because I believe that, not only is our country not teaching science at the rate we need to be competitive on the globe and innovate the way we should, but also just to be a scientist is not seen as cool or something you should be doing when you're young, Black or brown in this country. It's just not cool. And that was the reason I wanted you to come up here, so that people can see, like, look, there are Black people who have these conversations and are, part of learning what the universe is really all about.
yeah, I think Neil played a really big role in setting me on the path that I'm on, in the sense that my senior year of college, I was actually feeling pretty down about being in physics and astronomy. I was in a program where I was the only Black woman undergraduate. There had been a lot of racism. I was one of the only working class students in my class, and so I had to work through school, whereas my classmates were just doing their homework. And I went to my first National Society of Black Physicists meeting, and he was giving a keynote there, and a professor who had taken me introduced me to him, and I said something silly like, wow, this conference is really amazing. Who paid for it? And Neil was like, did you read the program? It's right there in the front of the program. He says, where's your program? I said, it's in my backpack. So Neil walks behind me, opens up my backpack, and starts taking everything out of my backpack and telling jokes about it. This was my first Neil Tyson experience. But then he gave this amazing speech at the banquet that day where he talked about how being at the National Society of Black Physicists allowed him to be his whole person. So he could be in a room, sitting around having a conversation about whatever science they were working on, and then suddenly somebody would say, like, oh, I got pulled over for driving while Black the other day. And this was the one place where nobody was going to be like, are you sure it was because you were Black? Because scientists love to play devil's advocate, and they don't really know a boundary of, like, look, you know what it's like to be Black. I don't know what it's like to be Black. And it's strange because they're supposed to be such logical and data-oriented people, but they really have a difficult time with the idea that there's some data that's not accessible to them in the same way.
Well, that's white supremacy. That's what it's all about.
No, that's it. Well, yeah, my favorite phrase. Right?
So, Shani.
Oh, Shani.
She wants to talk to you about supreme mathematics,
Speak on it,
God.
God.
So what's today's math, Shani?
Well, today is the 13th,
Which is
knowledge, understanding, all being born to culture freedom. This is supreme mathematics. This is not the same as regular numerology.
He's playing himself already. Playing himself.
Why am I playing myself?
Because she studies numbers.
Oh, yeah, I know, but numerology and supreme mathematics is a little different.
Well, right, but she studies numbers. I didn't say she studied numerology.
And there is some a common thread, between that. So if you can school me, I can.
No, she just wanted to learn, but you was already she was trying to learn about supreme mathematics so that she could learn.
I'm the student here.
She's the student so that she could learn.
Today's math.
No, you didn't, but you didn't give me a chance to get there.
Right.
So each number 1 through 9 has a meaning. What is 1?
1 is knowledge.
2,
2 is wisdom.
3,
Understanding.
4,
culture freedom.
5,
Power and refinement.
6,
Equality rules.
7,
God.
8,
Build and destroy.
9.
9 is to be born. Completion.
So, in the way that you
Wanna
think
go
about
in your
it,
space?
about this, is this something that tells you about what the day is going to be like, or does it guide how you are throughout the day?
Well, when you're doing the math of the day, it's supposed to be more of a guidance thing.
Okay.
So you're adding up the day's numerology based off of the sun, moon, and stars or whatever. But let's say today being 13, knowledge and understanding, knowledge being the information and applying understanding to that, being born, meaning equal to culture freedom that allows you to take the knowledge with true understanding, allows you the freedom to be able to move with more freedom, if that makes sense.
Or free your mind.
I
Free
like
your mind.
that.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I like that.
So it's kind of like a guide for young black men who are like in the 80s trying to find information on how to be stronger individuals and move with a certain type of righteousness and intuition to say, look, this is going to be your map for the day based off of the sun and moving in a way that
And when you would leave
makes
the
sense to
house,
you.
when you would leave the house on your block, there would be OGs on your block.
Yeah.
And they would say,
What's today's mathematics?
and you would
had
need to
be
know.
able to regurgitate this information to them so that they knew that you knew what time it was and how you were supposed to move out here.
I totally miss. I'm gonna have to ask my cousins about this who grew up in Crown Heights because I never heard anything about
They
this.
probably know about it, I'm
Okay.
sure.
Go up to him and ask him what's today's mathematics.
Okay.
And they'll drop some science on you.
I'm gonna do that.
So, and the
Yeah.
reason I wanted to have this discussion is because in the hood, this was a thing that was very much taught.
Yeah.
Very much taught every day. It was a conversation that happened every day, especially amongst black men. But these same black men either didn't have the opportunity, right, or weren't encouraged to go farther and take this love of numbers and math and trying to understand the universe and become actual scientists.
True.
Yes. I think this is, I have like such a long list of reasons why things like this happen. And even I think at various points might have been discouraged, except I was a very good test taker. I was a very good standardized test taker. And so I was classified as highly gifted by the time I was like in 3rd grade or something like that. And it's kind of like a rich get richer situation that once you're labeled in that way, there's a bunch of resources that people offer to you that don't get offered to you if you're not. That didn't change the fact that I still got thrown out of the classroom by my teachers for misbehaving. I was a pretty well-behaved student. I'm a little bit outspoken, so maybe that caused some problems sometimes.
And I
But I think
think-
that's part of it.
Another part of it is too, when you deal with the education that they give us in the schools, there's a relatability thing that most urban young men don't feel. So now when you had the supreme mathematics, it showed them how to apply this information to themselves versus American history, which felt like so far-fetched from their reality.
Or it felt like a reinforcing how oppressed and, ugly you
Right.
were.
But it's important to also say that part of the problem is that the history that we teach is dishonest. I didn't learn until fairly recently, for example, that it was a black slave who figured out how to cultivate vanilla in large amounts.
Yeah.
And that changed the way we eat completely. It changed world history. There's a lot that we don't know about the contributions that Black people made to science, to doing mathematics, that part of what we consider to be European math potentially came out of North Africa. Some of it certainly came out of India and the Middle East. There's actually some interesting Jewish stories here because Jews were often the translators between the different languages. And so we teach people this American history where we don't tell people about Benjamin Banneker, or if we do talk about a Black scientist, he's the only Black scientist that you ever hear about. So I think that that's also a piece of it. And so actually, in relation to that, being a Black woman, I actually recently asked the question on Twitter, can you give me an example of a Black woman who was involved in an invention or some kind of scientific work before the Civil War? And potentially like in the South, like maybe a story about a slave who innovated or something like that. And nobody could find me a story. every single tweet that came to me was, well, here's a Black woman who became a doctor in Philadelphia. But yeah, free Black people became doctors back then. But we have stories about Black males who were doing things like vaccinations or another one, that it's interesting now that there's a stereotype that Black people are very anti-vaccination, which is not even really true. But it was actually an innovation that came out of Africa and was delivered to us on the Middle Passage. And that would change the story for young people to hear those things at
For
school.
sure. Because if you felt like you had a connection to it, you might be a little more interested versus something that you already feel like you don't have an opportunity to be anywhere near and doesn't feel like it connects to you in any way. But if you knew that it came from us, started from us, and you have a direct tunnel or vessel or whatever it is to get there.
But Shawnee, how dare you want to learn things that you relate to and uplift yourself? And believe in yourself. How dare you? What's wrong with you?
I mean, it's the audacity.
You're not happy
The
to be
audacity.
the audacity.
Indeed.
You're not happy we saved you from the savagery of
I should be
Africa
happy
and brought
with
you to America to
the
build
crumbs
this
of information
for free.
that I get, and the crumbs of jobs.
You
and
should be
opportunity.
grateful.
I mean, I understand.
The white man saved you.
But that's basically the message we get at school, right? Is aren't you lucky at the end of the day that we finally decided to share our science with you, and even that's the message we continue to get through minority serving programs. Like people talk about, so some scientific societies put out statements this week that were crap, basically, about people of color and how people might be having hurt feelings right now. Like that's how we're feeling, hurt feelings. And they said, and this is kind of outside of the purview of our society, but we remain committed to inclusion. And so the question, and this is the piece that I wrote last night, is what's their plan for including Tamir Rice in science? What's their plan for including Ayanna Stanley Jones in science? You can't separate those two things. And it's not just about making sure that they're not shot for being Black and born, basically, but also that we're not killing their minds when they go to school by telling them that they have to honor Thomas Jefferson, who was a slave owner and probably a sexual assaulter, basically, and owned his own children and his wife's sister. It's all kinds of weird. I mean, Black kids are smart. Black kids are smart, and they put those pieces together, and they're like, that stuff's not for me. And I got very, very lucky that my mom is an activist. She had been to college. She came from a family of teachers. She had been a teacher. One of my middle names is Sojourner. And actually, my other middle name is Rosalind, and it's spelled the way that it is because of numerology.
Really?
Yeah, so it's not, I'm named after two members of my family, but it's spelled differently from theirs because my mom wanted the numerology to work out.
So how do you connect the spelling of your name with numerology?
So I guess she had a number that she wanted my name to come out to.
Was it placed on like how the alphabet?
Yeah, based on the alphabet. And my great grandmother and my auntie, who still lives here in Brooklyn, are both Rosaline. And my mom added up the numbers and didn't like how Chanda, Rosaline, Sojourner, Prescott, Weinstein came out. So I became Rosalind with an Lyn instead.
So that your whole name would condense to one specific number.
Yeah.
Which number is that?
Oh, gosh. I think it's 5.
You don't know the math.
I think it's 5.
You don't know the math.
I at some point sat down and calculated it, but I do think as a result of this, I think by the time I was 5 years old, if you asked me who Sojourner Truth was, I could tell you. If you asked me who Harriet Tubman was, I could tell you. I could tell you that Harriet Tubman used astronomy to guide people to freedom. And I think that that is the one scientific example that we know of a Black woman doing science back then, is that Harriet Tubman was, I guess what we would call today an amateur astronomer. Yeah.
Wow.
Chanda Prescott Weinstein.
I'm just curious. Do you have young women that reach out to you either sharing stories of being intimidated to follow a path like yours?
Yes.
Or just in for guidance? Because I would think, because, I mean, listen, for someone who is not like, it's inspired early on like you, that would consider a path like this, I could imagine being super intimidating and discouraging. And especially as a woman and a woman of color.
Yeah, so I get messages all the time. It's actually really difficult emotionally for me because I'm constantly hearing repeats of stories
Right.
of things that I have been through. and thinking, oh, but it's been 10 or 15 years.
And it's still happening.
And it's still happening. I actually, and people reach out to me in all sorts of ways. I get messages on Twitter. I get Facebook messages. I get emails. I get emails from parents. So a recent one I actually got was from a Black woman who graduated from a top 10 private university in the last couple of years. And she said, I can't decide what to do with myself because I've been discouraged so many times. Like I had one professor at my institution who told me that people like me just don't do science. And I think a lot of times people say, oh, it's just unconscious bias. People don't mean it. What did that guy mean? You know what I mean? That's not unconscious bias. That was get out of my classroom. You don't belong here.
Right.
But I hear stories like that all the time. And starting from when they're high school students, I get emails, and it's not just from girls, but also from boys and from young men and young women. And it can be rough because there's only one of me.
I know.
And I have all of these other things I need to be doing, and I don't have a faculty position yet. And the story in the physics community is that you're not supposed to pay any attention to these emails. Don't respond to them. Don't mentor the students. Don't take care of your community. Because I'm just supposed to focus on writing papers. And if I'm not writing papers, I'm not making a contribution to the scientific community. That's the... And the other thing is...
So you're not making a contribution to the scientific community by communicating with potentially other people who want to be scientists?
Right. And obviously, so for those of us in this room, right, that's not very difficult to understand. That basically the message is those Black students, they're not important. They're probably never going to make an important contribution. So whatever, we don't need to make sure that they are in the classroom. We don't need to make sure that they're feeling welcome and comfortable and like they can be included in the same way. That has to be your fundamental assumption. Otherwise, actually what I do is very, very important because these are people who are getting locked out for stupid reasons, right? So the softer version of this is people will say, well, you don't really want a research career. You should just go into full-time teaching because you don't really care about research because you also care about racism. And that's such a weird combination because the suggestion is that the research community should only be people who don't care about racism. And that's
wasn't science used to reinforce racism
Yes.
in the world and this country?
Yes.
So how in one breath, when science, they used what was known then as niggerology, which was a real study of Black slaves to reinforce how primitive and stupid Black people were, and created these theories that were then put in journals, scientific journals in this country that then went out to the greater public. Like some people smarter than you have giving you the reason that it's okay to make the people who look like this slaves and you can own them because they're just like animals. That was done in this country in the late 1800s and early 1900s, right? So science was used for that, but scientists who are of color today can't also, like, that's the disconnect for me.
So, I mean, there are a lot of horror stories. A lot of what we knew about gynecology and obstetrics, so basically women's health, medical science, was figured out by gynecologists, white male doctors who experimented on Black female slaves without any kind of anesthesia because they believed that Black women did not feel pain. And so a lot of white women's lives were saved in the early 20th century by these surgeries that they learned how to do by experimenting on Black women. And then if you go even further back, at some point, people were interested in observing an eclipse. I think this is in the 18th century. And so they sent an expedition from Europe to the island of Saint Domingue, so where the Dominican Republic and Haiti are. And they did observations from the island. And one of the motivations for funding the expedition, so there's a version of this where it's like astronomers were curious and they were learning about the universe and about eclipses and how to do observations with telescopes, which at that point were still kind of a new piece of equipment. But the other thing is that they were trying to figure out how to more accurately measure the distance from Europe and from Africa to the Caribbean so that they could make the shipping of slaves more efficient. And they could make the shipping of the goods that the slaves were producing on the islands more efficient. And so even the astronomy community has this root that is tied into slavery and tied into the Middle Passage. So, yeah, so the idea, I mean, when they say like you shouldn't really pay attention to racism, they're saying look the other way. They're not saying that you shouldn't be involved in it. They're actually just saying the community is involved in it. Look the other way. If you can't look the other way, you don't belong here. And I am clearly a person who can't look the other way.
Give it up for Dr. Chanda on the program right now. You can look up. What's your Twitter handle so people can follow?
It's kind of dorky. I'm a K-pop fan, so it's a reference to my favorite K-pop star, G-Dragon. He's a member of a group called Big Bang. So it's IBJIYONGI, IBG Yongi.
Give it up for her. Thank you for
you're
coming on the
awesome. Thank you
program.
so much.
Awesome.
Thank you for having me.